The Graduate Certificate in Humanistic Buddhism, we're very honored to say, is the first such course in Australasia, if not in the world. It's intended for individuals who wish to explore on the journey of self-development, also for educators.
I think anybody who's working with groups of people in workplaces or in community work.
And definitely for Buddhists of all traditions who wish to serve their communities using humanistic values and principles.
Buddhist values are essentially human values. So I'm confident that people who are interested in exploring living good human values like compassion and wisdom and care will be attracted to the course for that reason.
You can't believe how beautiful this building is until you go in it.
All courses in the Tien Institute base ourselves on contemplative education, a principle of path finding rather than path following.
They have a depth of feeling about what they're doing that they want to bring the students into and share.
The practical wisdom of humanistic Buddhism, as well as some professional wisdom.
Whatever they bring from this former life, they bring into the classroom and we blend it and meld it with Buddhism, and that really makes a fairly rich experience for students.
So I think it's very relevant that we do it now, here and now, because we need it. I think at least I need it.
There is a meditation hall available to our students to practice as well as to relax in between classes.
They're teaching from quite a different perspective because it teaches students how to care for themselves in often very challenging workplaces. So the students get a lot out of that, and that's information we get back time and time again.
Have the temple there, institute here, just a walking distance across the new bridge.
You can just get up and go for a walk over the temple and you will chill out straight away.
I've never had that sort of experience before, and I think it's fantastic. I'd never tried Tai Chi till I came here, and now I can see how it helps you physically and mentally.
And throughout the day, students will be encouraged to do reflective journaling. Rediscover the intrinsic human values that we already possess and use them to benefit humanity and to build a world that the human race can be proud of. To me, humanistic Buddhism is being the extraordinary in the ordinary daily life. Being the best of who we can be as a human and connected with everybody else. A Buddhism of service to the community at large.
Humanistic Buddhism really takes Buddhism and applies it how the Buddha meant it to be applied, to help people. And so that's why we're running these communities of practice, to build effective communities. The workshops will contain mindfulness, meditation, expert speakers sharing their wisdom. These will help people take back their skills to their workplaces, families and local communities and really apply them to the challenges facing their lives.
All of you should have complimentary reflective journals that we have developed here in Tien Institute. It's an opportunity for you to document the precious thoughts. You may draw and write your insights in this book.
Today's been pretty fantastic, I think. Yeah, I've definitely learnt a lot from all the speakers.
What I liked the most was the great community.
Something that is not necessarily something that you get into books. You also have to really learn about it and see how people embody it here.
I found people very enthusiastic, seriously enthusiastic through the whole day. I think people were generally exploring, seeking ways in which they could do exactly what this program is about, which is finding ways in which by empowering yourself, you empower the community around you.
It's made me even more aware of how much effort we have to put in as individuals to create something better for everybody else.
I think that our sessions are beneficial to anyone who is interested in developing from the inside out.
It will help them to explore not only themselves, but how they can have an impact on their world.
We live in troubled times, challenged by human impact on our planet and injustices in our society. We also confront danger and fear, all because of self-interest. The Humanistic Buddhism Center was founded within this world with an informed mission to bring the best of our shared humanity back through teaching support, linked historic and current research, and community outreach.
The NPI Ethos project is dedicated to understanding how humanistic Buddhism values are embodied and expressed throughout every organizational entity at NTI.
The challenge for Tien Institute, along with all organisations, is to bring to life the ethos in its classrooms, its offices and community activities, and not let it languish as well-meaning words on an advertising brochure. That's the focus of this research project.
In a way, the network is special because we try to go beyond studies of Buddhist doctrines to tell the stories of Buddhism as a lived religion. Humanistic Buddhism does not exist in isolation. As it meets the plurality of Buddhism in different parts of the world, we want to understand how it shapes and becomes shaped by all these different agents and conditions it comes across.
Our HBC strategy seeks depth and understanding. Our global community of translators, editors, and proofreaders provide quality translation of key articles on humanistic Buddhism from Chinese into English. We do this using an innovative cloud-based process. Beginning in our 4th volume, we've included select English articles as well. Our e-journal is available on the website for scholars and students.
What we hope the NTI Visualizer does for you is to help you quickly make sense of the growing research on engaged and humanistic Buddhism. It features an interactive interface, graphically representing our extensive survey of research on humanistic Buddhism. Simply select the collection, enter your search term, and we'll get you to the publications that matter the most.
Members of the NTI Communities of Practice take time out for just 30 minutes every week to reflect and recharge at the Sunday check-in sessions. Led by experienced facilitators and building upon the wisdom of the entire group, it has become a healing space for friends from all around the world to pause, practice, and connect.
The Humanistic Buddhism Center is at a new threshold. With a strong platform now, like an earthworm providing nutrition at the roots of a beautiful flowering and food-producing sacred garden, we provide support for humanity's future. We welcome new contributors to join our community.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. What a brand new year, 2023. Hopefully it will be a great new year for us for our first Dharma Symposium by the BLIA Sydney chapter. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the country. In the spirit of reconciliation, the BLIA Sydney chapter acknowledges the traditional custodian of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people today. So this morning, like I said, we have two very special guests with us. Both of them have great accolades to their name. And we have such pleasure in inviting them to this Dharma Symposium. And it's such a great way to kick off the first symposium for the year. Joining us will be Bhante Dhammika and also Venerable Juewei. They will be discussing on the book that Bhante Dhammika has recently wrote, which is Footprints in the Dust, the life of the Buddha from the most ancient source. So they will be discussing and having this opportunity as well for some of our guests, our friends online to ask questions. So firstly, our first speaker, Sravasti Dhammika, was born in Australia in 1995 into a Christian family and converted to Buddhism at the age of 18. In 1973, he went to Thailand with the intention to become a monk, and from there, he went on to Laos, Burma, and finally to India. For the next few years, he traveled around India, learning yoga and meditation, and finally ordained under the Venerable Sangha Prajna. The last disciples of Anagarika Dhammapala. In 1976, he went on to Sri Lanka, where he studied Pali at Sri Lanka Vidyalaya, and later on became one of the co-founder of the meditation center called the Nilambi, and became one of the teacher. Since then, he spent most of his time in Sri Lanka as well as Singapore. Bhante has written over 25 books and scores of articles on Buddhism and related subjects. He's well known for his public talks and represented Theravada Buddhism at the European Buddhist Millennium Conference in Berlin in 2000. And our facilitator, which is our second speaker, is Venerable Juewei. She's the senior lecturer and the director of Tien Institute's Humanistic Buddhism Center. She holds a PhD in Religious Studies, a Master's of Arts in Buddhist Studies, a Master's of Business Administration, and a Master's of Science in Computer Science and Engineering. Like I said, what an accolade to these two speakers that we have today. They will be discussing with us the Buddha as a human and a humanist. So what was the Buddha like in the human, as a human and in a human world? And how does he relate to others? So let's now welcome Venerable Juewei and also Bhante Dhammika to start off our discussion.
Thank you very much, Alan, for your gracious introduction. Please allow me to also begin by acknowledging the Wodi people of the Dharawal Nation as the traditional custodians of the land on which we at Tien Institute reside. I also pay my respects to their elders past and present and extend those respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of today. Further, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which you all are based. I also want to acknowledge the hard work of Venerable Juefang, Alan, and a team to put together this series of meetings in the Dharma. I acknowledge everyone present too, from students in Tien Institute, all those of you from Tien Institute's communities of practice, and from the Buddha's Light International Association, as well as all of you from around the world. Auspicious greetings. It is during this period of transition from 2022 to 2023, when memories of 2022 still linger and hopes for 2023 are starting to emerge, that we become conscious about the passage of time and the concept of time. And all the more we long for timeless wisdom and insights. Hence, I'm very grateful for this opportunity to begin the new year with you, with a Dharma chat with my friend, Venerable Dhammika. Welcome, Bhante. Let me just add a few words to what Alan has said about Bhante. In addition to those accolades, he's also, and for the last 3 to 4 years, has been a guest lecturer at Tien Institute's foundational texts in Humanistic Buddhism, in which he shocked my students by proving that our much loved episodes of the Buddha's legends are nothing more than legendary. So before I invite Bhante to talk about his latest publication, let me begin by inviting Bhante to tell us a little bit about his backstory. So Bhante, we understand that you became a Buddhist monk at the age of 25. What conditions in your first 24 years of life in Australia led you to this momentous decision?
Oh, well, thank you for that, and thank you for that invitation. I think I was a pretty normal Australian kid, and my family weren't particularly religious, but when the census came around, they always put down that they were Christians, but I don't think I can remember either my father or mother ever going to church. But anyway, I certainly had an interest in religion. I used to go to church. In fact, I think now that I remember, the only time I ever saw my parents were in church was when they had me baptized. Why they did that, I don't know. But anyway, I feel much safer that I've been baptized. Anyway, then I think I became sort of fairly religious. But by the time I was about 17 or 18, that had faded. But I still had this interest in religion. And one day I found a book on Buddhism, and it really captured my imagination almost straight away. I can still remember the name of the book. It was called The Mind Unshaken. It was written by an Englishman. He was the London Times correspondent in Burma in the 1950s and 60s. And he had become a Buddhist. And the book really attracted my attention. And although I didn't understand a lot of it, what I did understand appealed to me. And from that time onwards, I tried to read everything I could about Buddhism. And eventually I considered myself a Buddhist. And so it was 1993, I went to Asia with the intention of becoming a monk. And I sort of went around Thailand. I met people in Thailand who were Thai people are very, very friendly. And when in discussion it came up that I wanted to become a monk, one of them in particular took me to see Achan Buddhadasa and other quite famous monks. And then I went to Laos, and I went to Burma 3 times. In those days, you could only stay in Burma for 5 days. So I went there, I met some people. They introduced me to a meditation teacher called Upanyadipa, quite a renowned monk. And so I went back to Thailand, renewed my visa, went to Burma again, did a 7-day meditation course. which was, I had tried to meditate before, but I really didn't know what I was doing. And so from that time onwards, I sort of had a regular practice. And I quite liked Burma, but you simply couldn't stay there in those days. So I decided to go on from there to India. Then I did a Goenka talk course in India very early, must have been 75 or 76. But my intention was to become a monk. So eventually, when I visited the Buddhist sacred places, I ended up in Sravasti or Sawati, that's what it's called in Pali, and there was one Sri Lankan monk there, and I quite liked him. He liked me. He taught me all sorts of things, and so it was eventually there that I was ordained. And then he advised me. He said, "Look, there's only so much that I can teach you, and we're out in the middle of nowhere." In those days, Sravasti was a really remote place. It really was. Not now, it developed quite a lot. But, and so he advised me to go to Sri Lanka. So I went to Sri Lanka. I studied in Sri Lanka Vidyalaya, a well-known monastic college, and that's what happened.
Wow. It really looks like your reading habits and a book made that big difference, the big step in your life. I mean, reading that very important book has caused you to start on this quest. And yourself, you've published more than 25 books in under 50 years. That is at least a book every 2 years, if my arithmetic is correct.
I didn't actually think of it like that, but yeah, you're right.
So it's not really common for Buddhist monks to publish as many books as you did. So what inspired you to do so?
Oh, well, I wouldn't agree with the first part of what you said. People like Bhikkhu Bodhi not only have published many, but his translations of the Majjhima Nikaya, the Samyutta Nikaya, the Anguttara Nikaya, and his recent publication of the Sutta Nipata with its commentary, I mean, altogether, that would be more pages than I've written. So he just didn't write, he did translations as well. But nonetheless, what inspired me to write? I just felt that I had something to say, which I sometimes thought that hadn't been said before, or hadn't been said in the right way, or enough hadn't been said about it. From a very early period, I was very interested in knowing Buddhism from the foundational sources. So while I read books on Buddhism or about Buddhism, it was reading the Buddhist scriptures that really sort of guided my studies. And when you read the Buddhist scriptures and you read books about Buddhism, sometimes you find that there's something of a gap between them. So, in fact, behind me here, I have the Tipitaka in Pali and in English, and I read it every day. And so it was knowing Buddhism from the primary sources that has always interested me.
I see. In fact, your latest book, Footprints in the Dust, The Life of the Buddha from the Most Ancient Sources, seems to be the culmination of that journey of knowing Buddhism from the foundational sources. And you said that this book was 35 years in the making. Would you like to share with the audience some memorable moments during these 35 years that shaped the book into the way it appears now?
Yeah, what I meant by that is it took me 3 or 4 years to write the book, but much of what I was writing and how I wrote was the result of studying Buddhism, and particularly the life of the Buddha, for the last at least 30 or 35 years. I think in my explorations of Buddhism, I think the only time I've ever had what I might call an aesthetic experience was before I was a monk, and I was in India and wanting to visit all of the Buddhist places, and I ended up in Gaya, which is at about 12 kilometers from Buddha Gaya, where the Buddha was enlightened. And I arrived there very early in the morning when it was still dark, and took a horse and cart along the road to Buddha Gaya. And in those days, the old road used to go along beside the river, the Niranjana River. And as I was proceeding, the sun sort of gradually came up, and it was a beautiful scene, mango trees and the early morning sun reflected on the river, and the sort of purple mountains behind, and small villages, and the first birds starting to wake up. And it really was a lovely sight. I still like that. In fact, I'm glad there's a new road, because now no cars or buses go along the old road. Anyway, and as I approached Buddha Gaya, the sun was just about fully up, and above the trees, I saw the top of the Mahabodhi temple. And I knew what it was. I just had this, I was overwhelmed by this ecstatic experience. And that has, even remembering it now, sort of fills me with a degree of sort of elevated positive feeling. So, yeah, to know that at that very place the Buddha became enlightened, it just inspired me enormously. So I've had other experiences, but none as intense as that.
Wow. From this, we are really seeing Bhante as a human. A human.
Last time I looked, I was, yeah. Yes, I'm a human.
So, someone with a childhood, someone who has had a transformational experience and had these moments of awe. What you call ecstatic.
Awe. There was sort of partly a sense of awe, yes.
Yeah. Since the topic today is about the Buddha as a human and a humanist, would you like to share with our audience your thoughts on this topic?
Yes, it's an interesting subject. I take humanism to be that which pertains to humanity, which is pretty broad. And perhaps you could add to that that which puts the human at the center of all its endeavors. That's what I would do, something like that. So if we go right back to the Greeks, certainly some of the Greek philosophers could be called humanist, early humanism. I would think Confucianism, I'd call it humanism. And I certainly would consider Buddhism and maybe Jainism. The founder of Jainism, Mahavira, also was a humanist in the sense that their primary concern was humanity. So, for example, if you look at the first verse in the Dhammapada, probably the most popular Buddhist scripture, it's Mano Pubangama Dhamma Mano Setta Mano Maya. Everything begins with the mind. So in some religions, it's God's mind that is important, the need to know what God wants, what he did, what he said, what he's going to do, etc. Whereas in this first verse of the Dhammapada, it changes the direction pretty much entirely, not so much to some external reality, but to myself. The idea being, if I understand myself and if I clarify my mind, I'm able to understand the world around me, the world in which I am, better. So the quest begins with myself. And I would say that is pretty similar to what has developed into modern humanism. And in that sense, the Buddha was a humanist.
Indeed, we are looking at putting the human in the center of all endeavors. So in writing this book, Bhante, what aspect of the Buddha's humanistic endeavors would you most like to emulate and why?
Well, of course, I'd like to be enlightened like he was. Well, I'll change the gist of your question just slightly. when you read books, encyclopedia entries, etc., when it's talking about the Buddha, you get a lot of stories. And they usually include these stories because they're really great stories. Like, for example, the four sights when young Prince Siddhartha is going through Kapilavastu and he sees an old man, a sick man, a dead man, and a wandering ascetic. It's a great story. Another wonderful story is the young Prince Siddhartha is walking in a garden and a wild goose with an arrow in it falls to the ground, and he picks it up and he removes the arrow, and then his wicked cousin Devadatta comes along and says, look, I shot that bird, give it to me. And they have an argument about who owns or who should have the wounded bird. And so because they can't agree, they go to the elders, the Sakyan elders, and they ask them, and each of them explains their point of view. They asked Devadatta, and he said, well, I saw the bird and I shot it. It belongs to me. And Prince Siddhartha supposedly says, well, who should own the bird? He who tried to take its life or he who tried to give it life? And so he ends up getting the goose. I think this is a marvelous story, but none of these stories are in the oldest sources. That's not to say that they are not true. They may be, although I doubt it. You might say they're too good to be true. So when you actually just look at what the earliest texts say about the Buddha, what emerges is not a golden figure sitting on a lotus with light coming out of him. What emerges is a human being. Physically, and in some ways, some other ways, pretty much an ordinary human being. I mean, there's a wonderful incident in the Tipitaka where the Buddha is giving a talk and he sneezes. One couldn't imagine Amitabha Buddha or one of the sneezing, or if he did, we certainly wouldn't say so. Anyway, he sneezes and everybody shouts out, long live, long live. And it interrupts the speech. And then the Buddha says, when somebody sneezes and you say long live, do they live long as a result? And people in the audience sort of said, well, no. He said, then don't bother doing that. So this appears to me to be portraying the Buddha as, in some ways, a very ordinary human being. There's another one, which I mention in my book, is that there are quite a few places in the Tipitaka where it mentions that before the Buddha entered a hall or a building or a monastery, he kneeled down and washed his feet. And there are several places where it mentioned when he arrived at a particular monastery, they gave him a bowl or a pot of water so that he could wash his feet. What's so special about that? Nothing really. It's just the sort of thing an ordinary person would do. But in later centuries, the idea that the Buddha could wash his feet, the idea that the Buddha could have dirt on his physical body was just couldn't be imagined. So in later centuries, the Buddha tended to be not just a human, but superhuman, almost to the degree of being like a deity. Whereas in the Tipitaka, he emerges, if you read them carefully, as physically and in some of his behavior, an ordinary human being. Psychologically and spiritually, and as far as his insights was concerned, he was far beyond a human being. But that's what I try to focus on in the book.
Yes, like you, Bhante, I'd like to be enlightened to and follow the Buddha's path and realize that, especially in reading your book, but in every other encounters of the episodes of the Buddha, that he is like an ordinary being, and we don't have to be worried about being an ordinary being. So when one is thirsty...
That's a good point. I like that. I agree with you there.
Yes. So when one is thirsty, one can drink. And when one wishes to learn, one can come to a Dharma chat. So we learned about the humanistic Buddha through your lectures in Tien Institute's Foundational Texts class. And you also met our students online to discuss their interpretations on the Buddha as seen through your eyes. And some of those students are now here in the audience attending this Dharma chat now. And I'd like to ask everyone attending the Dharma chat session to start thinking of questions you'd like to ask, because after this question, we'll be opening the floor up to you. So before we do that, Bhante, what value do you think is the most relevant for our postgraduate students to learn about in the humanistic Buddha?
Well, gee, there's quite a lot, but I think one thing that comes to mind straight away is, we often talk about the Buddha's great compassion, but exactly what that may entail doesn't always get discussed so much. When you read what the Tipitaka says about the Buddha, the impression that you get over time is just a very kindly person. I'll give you one example. There is a sutta where the Buddha, Ananda, and another person are having a discussion. And Ananda asked this third person a question, a probing question, which he can't answer, or if he did answer it, he would contradict something he said previously. So he tries to change the subject, and Ananda won't let him off the hook. He says, no, I've asked you this question. Can't you answer this question? And the man is fully aware that he's sort of been cornered. And again, Ananda keeps pressing him. The Buddha notices this. He sees how uncomfortable this person is. And so he asks him, incidentally, what's been happening in the royal court lately? And this person is relieved that it is the Buddha who has changed the conversation. And so Ananda realizes that this is the Buddha's gentle way of encouraging him not to keep on pressing this man when he obviously doesn't want to be embarrassed by what he'd said previously. Okay? And what that incident indicates to me is that the Buddha was very interested in transmitting the truth. And in the process of doing this, he often was involved in conversations and sometimes debates with people. But he was a cordial debater. His idea was, he realized that you don't have to win every argument. And I think that might be, for religious people, that might be an important point to keep in mind when you're discussing religious matters. That courtesy, some empathy for the other person, allowing them to have their say, and so on. These are aspects of compassion too. And that sort of thing is prevalent throughout all the records we have of the Buddha. He was a gracious, polite, and kindly person. And it would be nice if we could be like that. One has to notice that in politics and perhaps even in religion nowadays, there isn't a lot of courtesy. There isn't a lot of kindness. There is this determination to win every argument. So we should keep that in mind, perhaps.
That's so true, Bhante. And that also throws light on why Venerable Master Xing Yuan, the founder of Tien Institute, also says that one can not be very clever, doesn't be very intelligent, but one must be compassionate and kind. So that is extremely important, as you've pointed out, in a world today that's filled with so much crisis. The ability to step back, to look at the bigger picture, to be gentler,
to the world, but also to ourselves. And perhaps this is a time for us to open the floor to our audience and see if anyone has a question for the Bhante. Please feel free to raise your digital hand, and when I call upon you, you could unmute and ask a question. Alternatively, if you don't have enough bandwidth, you can type your question in the chat stream. Either Ellen or myself could read your question on your behalf. Okay, please feel free to ask a question. Yes, Oliver. Maybe you could just say a word about where you are, Oliver, and then you can ask your question. Thanks.
Oh yeah, I'm right now in Newcastle on a film shoot, so it's funny. Venerable, I was just thinking about being human. I think there's a saying from the West that, you know, to err is human, to forgive is divine. So I was just thinking, I think from the HB classes, I remember there was one instance in the Tipitaka where the Buddha changed his mind. I was wondering also, were there instances where he said, oh, I'm mistaken on that? You know, being humans, we always make mistakes. I was wondering if there's anything in the written canon where he said, oh, that was a mistake. We shall not do that again.
Okay. Did the Buddha ever acknowledge having made a mistake, or did he ever make a mistake? Well, yes, he certainly did. Once again, in later centuries, the Buddha came to be considered omniscient. You know, if you asked him, how many bricks are there in the Great Wall of China, he could tell you straight away. How many grains of sand are there in Bondi Beach? No problem, simple. Now, the Buddha never claimed to be omniscient. What he did claim is on a particular area of knowledge, that is pertaining to our spiritual destiny, our spiritual potential, that he claimed that he knew everything. But on other things, certainly not. I include one incident in the Buddha's life which is not often talked about. And so what happened was he was giving a talk to a group of monks on a particular meditation called Asubha Bhavana. And this meditation is still sometimes done. And basically it's contemplating the unattractive aspects of the human body. Something that we generally don't like to do. You know, you only have to go to a chemist shop to see how many products there are available to get rid of these unpleasant things. You could start from the top of the head, dandruff, go all the way down, the eyes, the nose, the teeth, the tongue, further down, so this is an aspect of being embodied existence that generally we don't want to, and we really don't have to pay attention to. But the Buddha's idea was that as far as, say, for example, sensual desire, particularly sexual desire, this can be a strategy for cooling such feelings, which is important for a monk and nun, and sometimes even for lay people at certain times. So when the Buddha instructed his disciples to think about the repulsive aspects of the body. And then he announced that he was going on a 3-month retreat and that nobody was to come to visit him except the monk who brought his food. So that's the background to the story. Now, some monks went away and they did this meditation and they became so repelled with themselves that they committed suicide. Yipes. So when the Buddha came back 3 months later, he noticed that some monks were missing and he asked where they were, and he was told what had happened. It was a terrible tragedy. So here is an example where the Buddha misjudged. So, for example, there is another widely spread, widely believed idea that the Buddha could read people's minds. And so he knew exactly what was needed for a person, what instructions were needed for them to make the breakthrough. So this would be an example where that clearly was not the case. So I have no doubts that the Buddha could read some minds, but not all of the time. Okay. And this mistake led to a tragedy. So there is a case where the Buddha clearly made a mistake. I don't know anywhere where he actually apologized. Certainly in this case, it doesn't mention that he apologized. He just collected the monks together and he said, listen, enough of that meditation for the time being. I'll teach you how to do mindfulness of breathing. But there's no record that he actually apologized for that. And I don't know any other area where he did.
Thank you, Bhante. Thank you, Oliver, for that really good question. Bhante, you are that all-knowing Bhante.
No.
You're always my go-to person. You know that every time the students ask me difficult questions about the Nikayas, by the way, secret, behind me, Bhante Dhammika. I was really the person answering your question.
Well, but it's also important to know, I don't know everything, but I think as a result of spending 3 or 4 years pretty much full-time writing this book, one tends to know a lot about a particular subject after you've spent so much time on it. So that's hardly surprising. What does surprise me is, I must say, is that somebody hasn't, to the best of my knowledge, at least in English, nobody has done what I've done in this book before. Now, I've read dozens and dozens of books and articles and encyclopedia entries on the life of the Buddha. And without exception, except for one, it's usually a mixture of the few facts and the legends. In fact, the only book that I know that did not do that was written in about the late 1880s by the German Orientalist, what was his name? You see, there's my memory gone again. Henry Oldenburg. It's called The Buddha, His Dharma, and His Order. And he presents a life of the Buddha based only on what the Tipitaka says. Now, that's not to say that there aren't other sort of good books. This is one I always recommend, Michael Caritha's book on the life of the Buddha, which I think is a very good one. And this one was a companion of mine for many years. I don't know whether it's still in print. It's Heinrich Schumann. He wrote 2 quite good books on Buddhism, but even he has some of the legends in them. In that sense, I think my book is unique. I hope so, anyway. I mean, there may be something in other languages that I'm unaware of, but at least in English. Only what the earliest records say.
That's right. And recently this year, a new book was published in the opposite direction from what you have published, Bhante. It's called The 1001 Lives of the Buddha by Bernard Faure. I don't know if you've heard about it. It was just published by the University of Hawaii Press. And what it does is the opposite of what you do. It revitalizes the myths and the rituals that go with the hagiography of the Buddha. By putting into context why these various legends have come to exist.
Why they developed.
Yes, that's right.
What's that called? I'm unaware of that.
It's called The 1001 Lives of the Buddha.
I see. Mm-hmm.
Yes, it's published in August 2022 by the University of Hawaii Press.
Well, I don't know what position it takes, but I think it's fairly obvious why such legends evolved and developed, at least perhaps for the first 500-600 years. So like in works like the Mahavastu, one of my favorite books actually, and the Lalita Vistara, and a little bit later Ashvaghosa's Buddhacharita, all of which include, it shows that many of these legends had evolved fairly within 200 or 300 years of the Buddha. And one of the reasons for it, I believe, is because when the monk Buddha was alive, nobody was interested in whether he had a wife or not. Nobody was particularly interested in what he did in his first 30, 25 years. People, what focused their attention was on what the Buddha had to say, not what his background was. And thus we, in the Tipitaka, we get no mention of him being married. He obviously was, because we know he had a son, but who she was and how many wives he had, we have no idea. His father, Suddhodana, is only mentioned twice, very briefly, in the Tipitaka. In fact, from the time he was born to the time he, up to the time he renounced the world, the Tipitaka says virtually nothing about the Buddha. Now, one can well understand that in later centuries, people wanted to know, gee, was he married? I mean, this extraordinary man, I want to know more about him. And so these legends evolved. And like I said, some of the legends may have a grain of truth in them. But as time went on, these legends became more and more fantastic. I mean, probably my favorite as far as off the planet is concerned is when the Buddha went up to the Tawatingsa heaven to teach his mother the Abhidhamma, and then he came down on this enormous sort of celestial escalator. I mean, that's a miracle. So, and then it just got, so increasingly the Buddha was divorced from his humanity, and that didn't always have good consequences.
Yes, but now we know where escalators came from. At least where the idea of the escalators came from. Well, we thank Rodney for your patience. Rodney,
yes,
please.
Thank you for that question, Rodney.
Yeah, good morning. If we're looking at the Buddha as a human with all human traits, do you think from your studies you have seen him after his enlightenment? Does he suffer any anguish or pain towards his predicament, you know, what is happening around him? And say like Jesus in the Bible, he suffered from his disciples not being very smart, I guess. Do you think Buddha kind of got frustrated or suffered anguish?
Good question. And already a surprising number of people have put that question to me and even challenged some of the things that I have written on that subject in the book. So the general feeling amongst traditional Buddhists, at least, is that the Buddha was sort of like a block of stone. You put a bucket of gold in front of him, you put a sensual woman in front of him, just no feelings whatsoever. Well, that certainly is not what the Tipitaka shows. And there is ample evidence for this. So, for example, I'll just give you one example. After his enlightenment, the story goes that Brahma or Brahma Sahapati came from the highest heaven realm and said, wow, you're enlightened, teach. And the Buddha said, oh, no, it would just be people would argue with me and it would just be a real bore for me. So here's an example of where he's...
frustration.
And there's another one. This is a very interesting one. I say a bit about this in the book, is that the Buddha was on duty all of the time. Almost without exception, when somebody wanted to talk to him, he made himself available. And one could imagine that there would be times when he just didn't feel like it. And there are, in fact, several places where he actually says that. It would be irksome for me. So clearly, every now and then he needed to have a break because the pressure of people coming to visit him, always asking questions. I mean, anybody who is a teaching monk knows that, oh God, the same question again and again and again. So did the Buddha have ordinary human feelings? Well, yeah, he had some of them. I think my feeling is that an enlightened person or a more highly developed person does have those feelings, but they're there and then they're acknowledged and then they fade and the person gets on. They don't go back and revisit that feeling or feel angry or frustrated that they had that feeling or feel ashamed of it. That it was there. It's gone, move on. It leaves no residue. I think that's what I said.
Yeah, that's a great explanation.
I think that's quite an insightful question, actually.
Oh, okay. That's a great answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodney, and thank you, Bhante. You know, when you mentioned this same question over and over again that the Buddha has to encounter, it's samsara, isn't it? We all face the same existential dukkha.
Well, there's another, I'll tell you another story about this. It's in the Digha Nikaya. So, I don't know, the Buddha's been talking to people all day, and so he wants to have a break. So he goes into his little kuti and he tells the monk who is acting as his assistant at that time, I don't want to be disturbed. Now, it so happens that some eminent Brahmins turn up in town and they hear that that famous teacher is in town also. So they're determined to go and see him. So they march off to where the Buddha is and they say, we want to talk to the teacher. And the Buddha's assistant said, no, he's simply not available right now. And these guys, they're Brahmins, they're used to getting their own way. And they say, well, if he's not available now, we're going to sit here until he comes. Okay. As it's so, they plonk themselves down and they're not going to leave until they see this man, you know. And then what happens is another monk turns up and he says to the assistant, you know, there's some guys waiting outside. They want to see the Buddha. He said, yeah, but the Buddha says he doesn't want to be disturbed. The Buddha told me I'm not to be disturbed. Don't disturb me. And he says, so I'm not going to knock on the door and tell him there's somebody out here, but you can if you want. So that monk goes to where the Buddha is, knocks on the door, tells him that there's some people outside waiting. And it doesn't say this in the Tipitaka, but I can imagine the Buddha going, oh, God. Oh, all right then. And so he comes out and he asks the monk to put his mat in the shade and he sits down and talks to these people. So once again, here's an example where what fame is like. You know, he was on duty much of the time and almost always he made himself available to anybody who was seriously interested in knowing what he had to teach.
What a compassionate Buddha. Thank you, Bhante, for sharing that story. We'd like to welcome Nan to ask the next question.
Thank you, Venerable.
Yes.
This is Nan. Thank you for your lectures last semester. I was in your class as well. My question is, as a human, we all sometimes make wrong choices, okay? So I really admire those people renounce like the Buddha. Yes, he left everything behind and find the answer, okay, to go and find an answer. And I heard that since 18, you were, because of one book, and then you decided you want to be to follow the Buddha's path, okay, to find an answer. I just wondering, have you ever think, oh, this is not the right path for me? Yeah, because as a human being, we always think, oh, this path no, couldn't get the answer I want, I go to the other part and I go to the other part. And my understanding of the Buddha, when he became enlightened, he also gone through many paths and then find the middle path. So I would love to hear, what about in your case?
That's a good question too, a very personal question. Have I ever had doubts about being a monk? Perhaps early on I did. I can't really remember. There have been times when I felt somewhat maybe frustrated or disappointed with the monk's life and perhaps the monastery I'm staying with, some of the other monks or something. I think that's bound to happen. And I may have toyed with the idea, but never enough to go beyond wanting to leave, and certainly not for the last 30 years. But certainly there have been times when, for example, I'll give you an example here. I try to keep in touch with the progress of Buddhism everywhere, but particularly in the West. And so sometimes I go to YouTube and put it in Buddhism or something like that and look at or listen to some of the people talking about Buddhism. And I'm really frustrated that so much of it is just nonsense. I'm sorry. I mean, you hear stuff and you wonder, where on earth did they get that idea from? And this makes me feel, sometimes it makes me feel quite frustrated that, nobody is claiming that you have to know everything. But if you're going to give a lecture on a subject, at least you should have done some background checking. And it seems to me that many of the things that I see are really very superficial. There are good ones. There's one called Doug's Dharma, which I really like. I think his name is Doug Smith or Douglas Smith, and I'd highly recommend them. They're very, very good. They're well presented, authentic, good Dhamma. But some of the others, and it makes you feel frustrated. In my case, perhaps a part of the thing that motivated me to write this book is to give an authentic account of what the Buddha was really like.
Yes, Bhante, I share in your frustration. And this is why in our classes, we try to encourage critical inquiry. That what's important is...
my feeling is it doesn't even have to be critical inquiry. Just inquire, find out, the material is there.
Yeah. Ask questions.
I heard one the other day, which I thought, oh, goodness me, where this person was saying basically the Buddha taught us to really enjoy ourselves and, put your feet up, light up a cigarette and take it easy. And the Buddha taught us to celebrate the body. Really? The Buddha was not where can I put it? The Buddha was not a New Age groupie. He wouldn't have been into New Age thinking. He was into very deep... He was interested in looking at some of the most crucial and critical questions in human existence. He wasn't interested in, this sort of feeling good philosophy, I would say.
So it's very good that we have your words recorded and your words published. So 2,000 years from now, nobody would say Bhante Dhammika was or said the following.
I don't think that will happen, but you never know. I hope so.
We now invite Lucy to unmute and ask your question.
Lucy, yes. Are you Lucy?
Hi, Venerable Bhante. I do have a question, and that's also the question I addressed in my assessment, actually, for the subject, and that is, in some countries and regions, big population is Buddhist or with the Buddhist faith. And in some regions with ethnic and cultural uniqueness, such as Tibet, And in such places, the mysteriousness of the religion plays an important role somehow in people's faith in Buddhism. It is somehow important to withhold such mysterious essence to ensure the secretness of their beliefs. So in such a case, do you think it might not be wise to inflict some facts, because like the historical, the real Buddha, such facts on those people who have been receiving the very traditional beliefs passed down from generations to generations? So in some cultures, I mean, being mysterious is even a upaya, or we call it expedient method to induce such people to get onto the path of the faith. So do you think to have the very objective idea or the fact of the Buddha will always work in different regions or different groups of people? Thank you.
So let me get it right. You're saying that in some cultures or traditions, in Buddhist cultures or traditions, there's this idea that there should be maybe a secret or a mystical aspect to Buddhism.
Yeah, mystical.
And is it a good idea to present another view, present the Dhamma as it is? Is that your question?
Yes. So in this case, that like your book, the footprint of the Buddha, it's a very the resources from the very ancient Pali Canon. So that is really the fact, and we respect the fact. But for that group of people, if they know this fact, they might be frightened and they lose their faith, their beliefs, because their faith is passed down from generation to generation. It involves a lot of mysteriousness.
Okay, I see the point you're making. I don't think so. I think that generally what happens is when people have a traditional belief, a strongly held tradition, they simply wouldn't read a book like mine. On the other hand, I've had this experience. Now, I lived in Sri Lanka for about 20 years, and I used to give talks there, and people would come. And this has happened to be many times, that a young man or a young woman has come to me and said, Bhante, we were brought up Buddhists, but it wasn't until I went to Australia and New Zealand or Canada and joined a Buddhist group there that I really found out what Buddhism really is. Now, that has happened to me more than once. One of the first people I ever met in Singapore, who became and remains today one of my closest friends and disciples, he told me he had been interested in the Dhamma for years, from a Chinese background. So his knowledge of Buddhism was the sort of traditional Chinese beliefs, which are, the Buddha is in there somewhere, but there's all sorts of burning paper money and what have you and that. And he told me that all his life he thought that was it. And it wasn't until he started attending some of my talks that he found out what Buddhism really was about. So I don't know that it is the fact that people will lose their faith when they get a deeper and perhaps more accurate understanding of Buddhism. It's just that the object of faith will change from something which was not really very coherent to something that is, to something that is perhaps not authentic to something that is authentic. That perhaps won't always happen. But what can you do? Can you keep on telling people stories just so that they don't get upset? Well, I suppose some people will do that. But once again, this was not the Buddha's approach. There's a good example of that. You may know the Sigalovada Sutta. Do you know the Sigalovada Sutta? Okay, so basically what happens is there's a young man there, and he's coming back from somewhere, and his hair is all wet. And the Buddha sees him and asks him what he's been doing. And he said, well, before my father died, he told me that all his life he'd worshipped the 6 directions, which is a traditional belief. In fact, in Singapore, I know quite often you see in shops early in the morning, people come out of the shop and they, with some incense, they worship the 4 directions. People still do it. So he said, Lord, my father on his deathbed told me that he's been doing this all his life, and he asked me to keep doing it. And so that's what I'm doing, worshipping the six directions. And the Buddha said, oh, that's good, because I teach my disciples to worship the six directions too, but in a slightly different way. And then he tells him that I consider the north to be mother and father, and the south to be parents and children. And so he agrees with him, but in significant ways changes that traditional belief. So when Sigola, the young man, told the Buddha that he's worshipping the six directions, he didn't say, oh, God, what a waste of time that is. That's completely wrong. He didn't do that. He agreed with him and then proceeded to keep on agreeing with him, but subtly and give an ethical significance to that particular practice. What's wrong with that? I think that's very skillful of the Buddha. And if one was talking to people from a traditional Buddhist background, which is perhaps not very mixed up with all sorts of other things, one should decide to do it in a gentle and respectful and non-confrontational way. I think one should do that. Were you speaking from a personal experience in something like this?
Venerable Bhante, not really personal experience, but just to wonder, because I know in some region like in China, Tibetan, and there are a lot of rituals, and especially the Vajrayana tradition. And I believe not all the people, and even only a minor group of people, they have the correct understanding towards such rituals, and a lot of people just to follow the traditions or the generation by generation, and they don't know the fact.
I think that's not only in Tibet, that's in most traditional Buddhist countries. In fact, it's in Muslim countries and Christian countries too. Most people just take it pretty easy and just do what has been done or what their parents have told them.
And I found that a lot of people, they were so satisfied. Yeah, they were so satisfied and grateful for what they are doing, like the Pure Land. They just chanting, and they do not have the. I do not know whether I can quote true face, but they really do not understand the background or the fact of the historical Buddha. They just put their face under some mysterious things, and hope a good luck and hope a better maybe next life or things like that. And they feel so grateful and so satisfied about it. So I just wonder if such historical fact are widely known by the most Buddhist people, and what will be their reaction or.
Yeah, so I think I answered that question. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bhante. Thank you, Lucy, for this question. That is something which I think we see all around us, even in myself. When I think, for me, learning the Dharma and learning to inquire about the Dharma actually gives me greater faith when I prostrate to the Buddha, when I go through the rituals. I think I'm able to translate those actions into something that takes me to a different plane. So we need, I think, different doors and different gates into the Dharma. But we mustn't get static in any particular position. And I'm really grateful to all my students in the classes. They've pushed me from level to level. So
I'll just maybe Lucy's question reminded me of a rather amusing incident that I had once. In traditional Sri Lankan Buddhism, it is believed that the Buddha was 18 feet tall. And I remember a very pious, sweet old lady once telling me, "Me Hamdaru there, did you know the Buddha was 18 feet tall?" And I said, "No, I didn't know that." When he went for Pindapata with his begging bowl, how did people put food in his bowl? And she went, "Oh, nee, never thought of that." And then I said, "And when people invited him to their house for a meal, how did he get through the door?" "Oh, nee, poor old lady had never thought of that." I don't know what happened to her as a result of my inquiries, but maybe it made her think a bit. And of course, the important thing is not whether the Buddha was 18 feet tall or not. The important thing was having a kind heart. So hopefully, and certainly she gave me the impression of being a very sweet, gentle old lady. So if she had a kind heart, that's more important than how high or low the Buddha was.
Perhaps we've got to add the Mahayana understanding of the Buddha's hands being longer than, very long and goes beneath the knees. That will help him to put the arms go right in front of her. All right. Any other questions? While we wait for the next question, Bhante, which is your favorite chapter in this book?
What can I say? I like them all. But people who have contacted me, it seems from what they say that most people seem to have liked the chapter 7, which is about a day in the Buddha's life. So what I've done is I've started at sunrise and gone all the way through to late in the evening, itemizing all of the things that the Buddha could have done in one day. And of course, this would have differed from when he was young to when he was older. It could have differed from the seasons of the year, for example, in the hot season and then in the cold season. But I've just selected things that the Buddha could well have done every day. So, for example, cleaning his teeth. You think, what, did the Buddha clean his teeth? Oh, yes, he must have, because in one sutta, he talks about the 5 advantages of cleaning your teeth. And then there's a very interesting sutta where it's just an odd comment where it describes the Buddha sitting or standing at the side of the river in a bathing cloth or a washing cloth. So clearly he was taken off his clothes in order to have a bath. But then he did things like, when it was appropriate and that, he would visit the local hospital to talk to the people there. That was one thing. Of course, he went for alms gathering. There's a very interesting story where he went alms gathering, that's pindapata, or pindacharya actually, and a man loaded his bowl full of rice. So naturally enough, the Buddha went the next day and the man loaded his bowl with rice. And so he thought, oh, this guy obviously is very happy to feed me each day. I'll go again the 3rd day. And the man gave him some rice, but grumbled under his breath, I can't get rid of this ascetic. So naturally enough, he didn't go again the 4th day. So this is, I think it's actually the 2nd longest chapter in the book, just describing the various things that the Buddha could have done in a day. And many of them are just ordinary things that we do. Washing his clothes and cleaning his teeth and having a bath and getting his food. And I mean, there's even one part in one particular sutta where it describes the food that was set before the Buddha. There's another one that I find really nice because it reminds me of some traditions in Sri Lanka, maybe in other Buddhist countries too. Like in Sri Lanka, when a family invites a number of monks, like 10 or 20 monks, to their home for a very special occasion, they will sort of parade through the street. And usually there will be a band in front of them, sort of playing traditional music. And they'll have 2 white cloths. So as the monks walk on this cloth, they move it so they can keep on walking on a white cloth all the way to the person's house. This is a common custom, a way of respecting the Sangha and what the Sangha represents. Anyway, there was a prince actually invited the Buddha to his palace for a meal. And he had a white cloth put from the bottom of the stairs to the top of the stairs. And the Buddha arrived and he stopped. And the prince said, come. And the Buddha said nothing and he didn't move. And the prince was unsure what was going on. So he asked Ananda, what's the problem? And Ananda said, the Buddha is thinking of the coming generations. He has compassion for the coming generations, meaning that other generations of monks may be treated with such respect that they end up becoming pretty haughty, expecting to be honored in ways like this. So in India, the white cloth would be equivalent to what we would call the red carpet, isn't it? Getting the red carpet treatment. So the man the prince rolled up the white cloth and the Buddha entered the palace. I can find that a very interesting story, that the Buddha accepted the respect he was given because he believed that he was worthy of it. But the evidence shows that he wasn't really fond of excessive respect. And if it wasn't forthcoming, he didn't make a comment about it.
Yeah.
And once again, I think that shows something very interesting about his character.
That's right. So anyway, that was the first chapter I read when I opened
was it? Well, others have told me the same thing. They looked through the index and they thought, that's interesting.
You titled it well, Bhante, very attractive. So for the last question, I'd like to invite Rodney to unmute.
Yeah, thanks. I grew up in a kind of Protestant community where worship was very bare and, basic bones, I guess, no images or anything. And I was interested in Buddhism from an early age, but the ritual and the colourfulness of, I guess, most Eastern traditions put me off a bit, and it's taken me about 40 years to get over that. And I was wondering if, the Buddha commented on rituals and, the elaborate, all the, colour of religion. I realise, India was a very kind of ritualistic place, I guess. But I wonder if what he thought about all the colour and rituals. I mean, I just took the 5 precepts and that's changed my life. I'm so pleased I did it. And I was just interested if he commented on that sort of thing.
Well, I'll come to that in a minute. The first thing is I think rituals are an integral part of our life. I mean, when the teacher comes into the room, the students stand up. They probably don't do that now, but when they play the national anthem, I don't know, you put your hand on your heart and you stand up. And when you see an officer, you salute. And all of these things are rituals. I mean, have a nice day has become a ritual. Happy birthday has been a ritual for a long time. Happy Christmas. Oh, and incidentally, happy Christmas, everybody, coming up soon. These are all blowing out the candles on the cake. I mean, these are performances that sort of give some sort of colour to our lives. I don't see anything wrong with any of that.
No.
I know, sometimes I'm asked as a Buddhist, people say, oh, happy Christmas. Oh, wait a minute, you're not allowed to do that. I like people saying happy Christmas. Around Christmas time, what's wrong with that? I've got no problems with these things. So in actual fact, there were rituals, as you correctly said, in ancient India, but there was a big difference. Most of these rituals were believed to have some magical consequence. So now we switch from things which have a social or a communal, they're to bind our communities together. And there are other rituals that people believe have got some sort of power. So the Buddha had no time for that. So he instituted very few rituals. In fact, I don't think he instituted any that I can think of. So there's something like taking the precepts, which you just mentioned. So I wouldn't call that a ritual. It's an avowal. You're making a promise to yourself within a public forum to say and to let others know that you have decided to make these principles an important part of your life. I wouldn't call that a ritual. But if you say, as I know some people do, that this somehow protects you, it somehow creates a sort of a magical awe, and now your karma will never be bad a little bit, then the Buddha certainly wouldn't have agreed with that. I mean, this is one of the reasons why he had sometimes a lot of hostility from the priests of the time, because what they were teaching was these various sacrifices, the yaga and what have you. They sort of compelled the gods to give you what you asked for and things like that. The Buddha had no... He quite strongly opposed those ideas.
Thank you. Thank you so much to everyone for these exciting suites of questions, and definitely to Bhante for your insightful answers. I just want to ask the last question of Bhante. Can I suggest we end this session by gifting everyone listening in with a New Year Dharma message, Bhante?
Am I allowed to do this? This is a ritual, isn't it?
It is. And it is a good one, just like you said.
It is, isn't it?
Yes,
Well,
Buddha would approve.
Well, just off the top of my head, I hope you'll keep in mind those words: goodwill to all and peace on earth. And the new year, the old year is passing away and the new one is coming. I hope it will be a happy and fruitful one for you and your family.
Thank you, Bhante. After reading your book here, I must say that while much of Lumbini, Bodh Gaya, Vesali, and Kushinagar are no longer standing, and the Buddha is no longer with us, we have the privilege of authors such as yourself who puts into words the inspirations of the Buddha. So may everyone find in the exemplary Buddha models for our own thoughts, speech, and actions, and may his words remind us to cultivate both wisdom and compassion. May the new year bring us immense hope to awaken ourselves and light up the world with the best of what it means to be human. I coined the term humanistic Buddhism as people becoming Buddhas through people. That's humanistic Buddhism for us all. And I hope that along this path of Buddhahood, you would also come to the Tien Institute and visit us, because I believe that higher education can and should make a difference. So thank you, Bhante. It was a very lovely conversation. And as always, your insights are invaluable and inspiring. Like you say, may we wish everyone good health, goodwill, and please keep safe in both body and mind. I now hand back to Ellen.
Thank you so much, Venerable Juewei, for taking that, facilitating this talk between yourself and Bhante on this topic. And also thank you, Bhante. Obviously, there's so much in there that you talked about. I've only taken a couple of notes, and I thought there was just a lot of wisdom that we, can rely on in this new year going forward as well. So especially like your experience in India, like what Venerable Juewei has mentioned, it is an awe to have visited those places. And I think, for me to have visited those places, it was quite a nice way to I guess, level up, I guess I could say, in my spiritual experience as well. So at the same time, having to go to have your book to go to is another way for me to experience that in probably a few more times from the places that I visited. And what resonated to me, what you said earlier, was the quest began with myself. Like I said, coming into New Year, it is another ritual that we do, which is New Year resolution. So it's a great way to remind myself and ourselves that it begins with ourselves. We can be the one to make the choices to see where we go from here and how many resolutions we can tick off our list this time, even though it may not be always a fruitful one by the end of the year. But hey, it's always good to start with ourselves. And like you said, Buddha is human, just like you and I. I believe practicing diligently, and that will help us to achieve what we want more in our lives, even though it does not mean that we can be enlightened, but it does mean that, we are enlightened in our own practice as well. So thank you so much. And I appreciate every single bit of dialogues that you have with Venerable Juewei. And hopefully we get to see you again in future and, make this a regular occurrence for our Dharma Symposium. And once again, thank you to all our audience and our BLIA members around the world, the students from the Tien Institute, and as well as anyone here listening. Thank you and have a great 2023. And of course, other than the one that we just listened to, we have the next Dharma Symposium, which will be in February. So make sure you join us on the next topic, which is about what is wealth in Buddhism and how do we maximize our wealth. Make sure you follow us on the Tien Temple YouTube to get to know the dates, and we'll see you soon.